My name is Askold Melnyczuk. Today, we're launching For the Record, a series of conversations with Ukrainian writers in a time of war. Ukraine is the only country I know of that was dreamed into existence by a poet. Born a serf in 1814, Taras Shevchenko was freed from slavery by the efforts of fellow artists. The painter-poet then took on himself the mission of telling the story of the indigenous people of Ukraine in their native tongue. For this, the Russian Empire punished him with decades of exile and imprisonment. This despite the fact that he wrote his prose in Russian. His Ukrainian language poetry, however, had the effect of solidifying and fortifying the indigenous people's sense of themselves. Ever since, poets have held a singular importance for Ukrainian culture. Language can readily become an instrument of oppression. The history of Russian censorship of its own poets is well known, thanks largely to Nadezhda Mandelstam's account of her husband Osip's trials in Hope Against Hope and its sequel, Hope Abandoned. Less well known is the way Russia exerted its hegemony over its colonies. The assault on Ukrainian culture reached a fever pitch under Stalin in the 1930s. I don't think there's a Ukrainian writer alive today who isn't aware of what happened during what I call the aborted Renaissance. Imagine 20th century American literature without Faulkner, without Richard Wright, or Willa Cather, or Hemingway, or Zora Neale Hurston, or Marianne Moore, or William Carlos Williams, Wallace Stevens, James Baldwin. Imagine contemporary American literature without them. It's unthinkable. But the unthinkable happened in Ukraine. In 1930, some 260 writers actively participated in the country's literary life. By 1938, only 36 remained on the scene. Surveying the facts of the fates of the missing speaks volumes about the leitmotif of that decade. Of the 224 missing in action, 17 were shot, 8 committed suicide, 175 were arrested or interred, 16 disappeared without a trace. Only 7 died of natural causes. Belarusian culture was similarly decimated and thwarted by Stalin. The crime for which writers and intellectuals in former Soviet republics were punished was that they dared aspire to autonomy and cultural independence. That Russia remains so threatened by the mere existence of other languages and cultures is a psychosis worth exploring. Racism can take many forms. To skin color and religion, one must add an inexplicable insecurity about the shape words take on the page, the sounds they make in our mouths. Behind the paranoia lies the fear that long-buried crimes against indigenous communities might finally see the light of day. Might once have seemed like ancient history, a record of one of the most terrible periods of the 20th century, was given fresh urgency and relevance with the publication of what historian Timothy Snyder describes as Russia's Genocide Handbook, published on RIA Novosti, Russia's official state news site, on April 3rd, just a few days after the discovery of the mass murders by Russian soldiers in Bucha. As Snyder describes it, I quote, "The Russian handbook is one of the most openly genocidal documents I have ever seen. It calls for the liquidation of the Ukrainian state and for abolition of any organization that has any association with Ukraine. Such people, the majority of the population, more than 20 million people, are to be killed or sent to work in labor camps to expurgate their guilt for not loving Russia. Survivors are to be subject to re-education. Children will be raised Russian. The name Ukraine will disappear. Men hep tavas agolas idir is the only line I know in Cornish. From a poem by the great British poet Tony Harrison, it translates to mean, quote, "The tongueless man gets his land took." While Ukraine has never been tongueless, it has long appeared that way to the world. No more. Freed from the yoke of empire, the country has become a cosmopolitan nation in which identity is not determined by language. What follows is a series of conversations I've been having with writers writing in Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, Crimean Tatar, since Russia launched its invasion on Ukraine on February 24th, 2022.